Good morning, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, Chairman Peters, and Ranking Member Portman. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify before your two committees regarding the attack on the United States Capitol that occurred January 6th. I have been in policing for almost 30 years. The events I witnessed on January 6th was the worst attack on law enforcement and our democracy that I have seen in my entire career. I witnessed insurgents beating police officers with fists, pipes, sticks, bats, metal barricades, and flagpoles. These criminals came prepared for war. They came with their own radio system to coordinate the attack and climbing gear and other equipment to defeat the Capitol's security features. I am sickened by what I witnessed that day. Our officers fought valiantly, using batons, shields, chemical munitions, and pepper ball guns to hold back the attackers. Capitol Police and responding law enforcement agencies showed tremendous restraint by not using their firearms, which would have likely led to a more chaotic situation and a possible mass casualty incident. No civilian law enforcement agency, to include the United States Capitol Police, is trained or equipped to repel an insurrection of thousands of individuals focused on breaching a building at all costs. I am extremely proud and appreciative of the Capitol Police officers, the Metropolitan Police Department, and the other law enforcement agencies that came to our assistance. A clear lack of accurate and complete intelligence across several federal agencies contributed to this event, and not poor planning by the United States Capitol Police. We rely on accurate information from our federal partners to help us develop effective security plans. The intelligence that we based our planning on indicated that the January 6th protests were expected to be similar to the previous MAGA rallies in 2020, which drew tens of thousands of participants. The assessment indicated that members of the Proud Boys, white supremacist groups, Antifa, and other extremist groups were expected to participate on January 6th, and that they may be inclined to become violent. Based on the intelligence that we received, we planned for an increased level of violence at the Capitol, and that some participants may be armed. But none of the intelligence we received predicted what actually occurred. Extensive preparations were put into place for January 6th that included the full activation of the department, intelligence and information sharing with our federal and local partners and department officials, implementing a significant enhancement for member protection, extensive operational enhancements to include significant civil disobedience deployment, and an expanded perimeter. We also distributed additional protective equipment for our officers and coordinated outside agency support. As recent as Tuesday, January 5th, during a meeting I hosted with my executive team, the Capitol Police Board, and a dozen of the top law enforcement and military officials from D.C., no entity, including the FBI, provided any new intelligence regarding January 6th. It should be also noted that the Secretary of Homeland Security did not issue an elevated or imminent alert in reference to the events at the United States Capitol on January 6th. We properly planned for a mass demonstration with possible violence. What we got was a military-style coordinated assault on my officers and a violent takeover of the Capitol building. I know that the images we saw of the officers battling for their lives and the visuals on national TV had a profound effect on the nation. The United States Capitol Police did everything we could based on the intelligence and available resources to prepare for this event. While my officers were fighting, my post was in the command center coordinating resources from numerous agencies around the National Capital Region to provide critically needed support. I was also briefing the two sergeant-at-arms and working on establishing accountability and priorities for the incoming resources. As Capitol Police and outside resources began to reestablish the security perimeter, I responded to the Capitol building to personally evaluate the situation and brief the sergeant-at-arms and leadership. I acknowledge that under the pressure of an unprecedented attack, a number of systems broke down. One of the reported issues described by officers was a lack of clear communications and directions from officials. It appears that the established incident command for the Capitol building was overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation and as officials battling insurrections as opposed to directing the response. There have also been reports that some officers may have felt confused or let down during the attack. As an official who cares as much as I do about my colleagues, nothing is more painful to me. These issues must be addressed through new training, policies, and procedures. Even our best efforts were not enough to stop this unprecedented assault on the Capitol. However, casting blame solely on United States Capitol Police leadership is not only misplaced, but it also minimizes what truly occurred that day. The focus going forward needs to be on the efforts to improve intelligence and the coordination of security measures between all involved agencies. Hopefully, this will be part of the focus of an independent after-action committee to look at all aspects of the January attack on our nation's Capitol. In closing, I want to again recognize the heroic efforts of the Capitol Police officers, who on January 6th, outnumbered and against the odds, successfully carried out their mission to protect the members of Congress and the legislative process. I couldn't have been more proud to be part of their team and the USCP mission. I'm available to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sund. Mr. Stanger.
Chairwoman Klobuchar, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Blunt, and Ranking Member Portman. The National Capital Region is a unique environment for law enforcement. The U.S. Capitol Police, in conjunction with the sergeants at arms, work to provide security of the Capitol complex and its population. But there is a shared responsibility with other law enforcement groups within the region. Sharing of information and resources is paramount for success. Once assuming the position of the Senate Sergeant at Arms, enhancement of the working relationship between my office and U.S. Capitol Police had been a priority. I am a proponent of the concept of intelligence-led policing. This methodology can be used in assessing threats to individual members as well as threats to the campus. As in all intelligence operations, it is only as good as the analyst assessing it. And that assessment is then placed in the appropriate hands to take steps in order to mitigate any threats. We have to be careful of returning to a time when possibility rather than probability drives security planning. Where the events of January 6th certainly reveal that a review of intelligence should be done. Returning to the concept of possibility driving security operations may result in poor use of resources. This is the constant give and take of security planning. There is an opportunity to learn lessons from the events of January 6th. Investigation should be considered as to the funding and traveling what appears to be professional agitators. First Amendment rights should always be considered in conjunction with these investigations. Law enforcement coordination in the National Capital Region should be reviewed to determine what can be done in a more efficient and productive manner. Intelligence collection and dissemination, training, and concepts on the use of force must be consistent. This integration should be accomplished without regard to self-interest and cost. In conclusion, whenever you prepare for a major event, just always consider the possibility of some level of civil disobedience at these demonstrations and plan accordingly. Events of January 6th went beyond disobedience. This was a violent, coordinated attack where the loss of life could have been much worse. This concludes my prepared remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Stanger. Mr. Irving.
Chairman Peters, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Portman, Ranking Member Blunt, and distinguished members of the committees. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. There's been a lot of press reporting about me, not all of it accurate, and I appreciate the opportunity to address some of that today. My name is Paul Irving, and I served as the Sergeant at Arms for the House of Representatives for the past 9 years. Serving in that role was one of the great honors of my life, and I count it a privilege to have worked with speakers from both political parties, including Speaker Boehner, Speaker Ryan, and Speaker Pelosi. I'm a law enforcement officer by training. My professional career started more than 40 years ago as an intern at the Department of Justice, and then as a clerk at the FBI. I later became a special agent at the Secret Service, where I worked on 2 different presidential protection details and ultimately rose to the rank of assistant director. Like you, I'm profoundly saddened by the events of January 6th. The entire world witnessed horrific acts of violence and destruction carried out by our very own citizens against the global symbol of democracy, our seat of government. I am particularly saddened by the loss of life, which included 3 officers. My heart goes out to all the families that lost a loved one. We began planning for the protests of January 6th in December 2020. The planning relied on what we understood to be credible intelligence provided by various state and federal agencies, including a special event assessment issued by the Capitol Police on January 3rd. The January 3rd assessment forecast that the protests were, quote, expected to be similar to the previous million MAGA March rallies that had taken place in November and December 2020. Every Capitol Police daily intelligence report between January 4 and January 6th, including on January 6th, forecast the chance of civil disobedience or arrest during the protests as remote to improbable. I relied on that intelligence when overseeing the security plan put forth by Chief Sund. The Chief's plan took on an all-hands-on-deck approach whereby every available sworn Capitol Police employee with police powers was assigned to work on January 6th. That meant approximately 1,200 Capitol Police officers were on site, including civil disturbance units and other tactical teams. I also understood that 125 National Guard troops were on notice to be standing by for a quick response. The Metropolitan Police Department was also on 12-hour shifts with no officers on day off or leave, and they staged officers just north of the Capitol to provide immediate assistance if required. The plan was briefed to multiple law enforcement partners. Based on the intelligence, we all believed that the plan met the threat and that we were prepared. We now know that we had the wrong plan. As one of the senior security leaders responsible for the event, I am accountable for that. I accept that responsibility, and as you know, I have resigned my position. Much has been said about whether optics affected my judgment in a January 4 telephone call with Chief Sund and Senate Sergeant at Arms Stenger about a National Guard offer to incorporate 125 unarmed National Guard troops into the security plan. The Guard's purpose would have been to work traffic control near the Capitol. My use of the word optics has been mischaracterized in the media. Let me be clear. Optics, as portrayed in the media, played no role whatsoever in my decisions about security, and any suggestion to the contrary is false. Safety was always paramount when making security plans for January 6th. We did discuss whether the intelligence warranted having troops at the Capitol. That was the issue, and the collective judgment at that time was no. The intelligence did not warrant that. If the chief or any other security leader had expressed doubt about our readiness without the National Guard, I would not have hesitated to request them. Chief Sund, Senate Sergeant at Arms Stenger, and I were confident in the chief's plan, and I did whatever I could to ensure that Chief Sund had the support needed to prepare and execute that security plan. And on January 6th, when I was asked for authorization to request National Guard assistance, I approved it. There are important lessons to be learned from January 6th. I commend the committees for conducting this proactive review of the events leading up to and on January 6th. I want to help the staff and members make changes and improvements and to ensure the tragedies of January 6th never occur again. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now begin questioning. I want to start out just to clear up one thing by just asking all of our witnesses a yes/no question. Based on what we know now, including the recent Department of Justice indictments, do you agree that there is now clear evidence that supports the conclusion that the January 6th insurrection was planned and it was a coordinated attack on the U.S. Capitol? Just say, everyone agree?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that this attack involved white supremacists and extremist groups?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that this was a highly dangerous situation, which was horrific, but could have actually been worse without the courage of the officers that you commanded?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so now let's look at what we knew leading up to it, or what you knew leading up to it, or what people that worked for you knew leading up to it. We knew leading up to it that on leading up to January 6th, President Trump sent nationwide tweets telling people to come to Washington on January 6th and saying, "Be there, will be wild." And according to public reporting by the Washington Post, the FBI's Norfolk field office issued a threat report on January 5th that detailed specific calls for violence online in connection with January 6th, including that protesters, quote, be ready to fight, end quote, and quote, go there ready for war, end quote. I guess I'll start with you, Mr. Sun. When a critical intelligence report is received by the Capitol Police from an intelligence community source like the FBI, who usually would receive it? And I guess I'll start with, did you receive this report?
Thank you very much for the question, ma'am. I actually, just in the last 24 hours, was informed by the department that they actually had received that report. It was received by what we call one of our sworn members that's assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is a task force with the FBI. They received it the evening of the 5th, reviewed it, and then forwarded it over to an official at the intelligence division over at U.S. Capitol Police Headquarters.
And so you hadn't seen it yourself?
No, ma'am. It did not go any further than that.
Okay. And then was it sent to the House and Senate Sergeant at Arms?
I don't believe it went any farther than from the over to the sergeant at the intelligence division.
Okay. And Mr. Irving, Mr. Stanger, did you get that report beforehand? Mr. Stanger, did you get the report?
No. No.
Okay. Mr. Irving?
I did not.
Okay. Okay, so I think that may have contributed part to the lack of information, but I'll leave that for the future. Now let's go back to another report. I know on January 3rd, Mr. Sun, you said in your written testimony that the Capitol Police published intelligence assessments of the event, including one on January 3rd. Do you mostly rely on your federal partners like the FBI to gather and analyze intelligence on potential threats to the Capitol and members of Congress?
Yes, I think what's important to realize as a law enforcement agency, we're a consumer of intelligence and information that's provided by the intelligence community. The intelligence community is 18 federal agencies that collect information, do the analyzing of the raw data, raw intelligence, and then provide it to us. So we're reliant on that information to be complete and accurate.
But in that report, we now know, according to your testimony, that tens of thousands of participants were likely to descend on Washington. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And the January 3rd memo, according to the Washington Post, made clear that supporters of President Trump see January 6th as the last opportunity to overturn the results of the presidential election, and that, quote, this sense of desperation and disappointment may lead to more of an incentive to become violent. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, ma'am.
The article also quoted the memo as stating that unlike previous post-election protests, the targets of the pro-Trump supporters are not necessarily the counter-protesters, but rather Congress itself is a target on the 6th. Is that right?
That is correct.
And did you have any indication that many of these protesters might arrive armed or that members of extremist groups might be there?
We knew that members of extremist groups would be there, and there was social media calls for people to come armed. Yes.
You've also said that at a January 5th meeting with Capitol Police, the Sergeant at Arms and federal law enforcement, military officials, all present at the meeting indicated that there was no new intelligence report for January 6th. Is that right?
That is correct, ma'am.
But your testimony states that the Capitol Police took a number of steps after these assessments, like what you said was the largest number of civil disturbance unit platoons possible, increasing dignitary protection coverage, coordinating with the D.C. police, and ordering all hands-on-deck status for Capitol Police. Is that right?
That is correct, ma'am. We took extensive efforts to prepare for the events based on the information, much of which you just reviewed, yes.
Okay, good. So if the information was enough to get you to do that, why didn't we take some additional steps? Why didn't you and others involved to be better prepared to confront the violence?
We expanded our perimeter. When we expanded the perimeter, again, we knew there was going to be some maybe limited violence, but we did. We expanded the perimeter. We took a number of steps to outfit our personnel with additional hard gear. We developed a plan for if we had protesters that may be armed. And that was one of the reasons, the expanded perimeter and the heightened risk, that I went to the Sergeant at Arms and requested the National Guard.
And But now you realize it wasn't enough, those security measures. Is that right?
Well, that is, hindsight being what it is. I mean, you look around the Capitol right now and you see the resources that were brought to bear based on the information we now know from January 6th.
Okay. Mr. Sun, you stated in your written testimony that you first made a request for the Capitol Police Board to declare an emergency and authorize National Guard support on Monday, January 4th, and that request was not granted.
That is correct, ma'am.
Your testimony makes clear that the current structure of the Capitol Police Board resulted in delays in bringing in assistance from the National Guard. Would you agree with that? That's one of the things we want to look at.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you think that changes are needed to make clear that the Capitol Police Chief has the authority to call in the National Guard?
I certainly do. I think in exigent circumstances, there needs to be a streamlined process for the Capitol Chief of Police, for the Capitol Police to have authority.
Okay. And Mr. Stanger, do you think that reforms are needed to the structure of the Capitol Police Board to make that clear?
I think a review of the Capitol Police Board and their statutory authority is probably would be a good time to do this now. There's a lot of statutes out there in the Capitol Police Board that go back many, many years. Things are changed, and it's probably to make the board a little bit more nimble. It's probably not a bad time and an idea to take a look at what's there.
It's probably an understatement with what happened, but thank you. Mr. Irving, your views?
I would certainly agree with both Chief Sund and Michael Stanger. I think a review would certainly be warranted at this time of the Capitol Police Board.
Mr. Sund, your written testimony states that you had no authority to request the assistance of the National Guard without an emergency declaration of the Capitol Police Board. Okay. On what rule, regulation, or authority did you base that view?
I'd have to go back and look the specific rule, but it's a standing rule that we have. I cannot request the National Guard without a declaration of emergency from the Capitol Police Board. It's kind of interesting because it's very similar to the fact, I can't even give my men and women cold water on an excessively hot day without a declaration of emergency. It's just a process that's in place.
And to be clear, apart from the Capitol Police Board, you also face delays in getting authorization to bring in the National Guard from the Department of Defense. Is that correct? We'll be hearing from them next week.
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
Would you agree that there were serious issues at the Pentagon that contributed to the fact that Guard troops did not arrive at the Capitol until about 5:40 that day after most of the violence had subsided?
I don't know what issues there were at the Pentagon, but I was certainly surprised at the delays I was hearing and I was seeing.
Okay, very good. And my last question, just as of all of you, in addition to the reforms of the police board, which are very clear need to be made, any other suggestions that wouldn't involve classified information you have for us, Mr. Sund?
As reference to some of the recommendations, I would look at, again, one of the big things that I think was a contributing factor to this was intelligence. I think as you meet with the intelligence community and law enforcement in the intelligence community, we have a very good relationship. I think the aperture just needs to be opened up a little bit farther. Like Chief Conte had mentioned, January 6th was a new day. It was a change of what threat we face, and I think getting them to open the aperture and looking a little bit harder. And I think internally, looking at some of our policies, procedures, our processes for how we handle special events, how we handle incident command, was stuff we can do. And then looking at physical security of the building and the grounds, I think is going to be critical. I know a lot of people have talked about, the fencing, the open environment. I understand, and I know that goes way back, and members of Congress like the open environment. I think there are ways to develop a more secure campus while keeping an open environment, but I'll leave that for more classified or restricted hearings.
Okay, thank you. Anything you would add in addition, just any other thing you'd add in addition to what the former police chief laid out here, Mr. Stanger?
I would be very supportive of those areas that the chief mentioned. I think he's right on the money there. I think there's maybe another area of use of force that probably needs to be coordinated better in the region here. But certainly intelligence needs to be taken a look at as to how it works. We have a lot of people that we've ramped up since 9/11. And I think maybe it's time to take a look at how how efficient it is on the gathering of intelligence and the collection of intelligence.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to allow my colleagues to ask that same question of you, Mr. Irving, and you, Chief Conte, because I've gone over my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Sun, you've made or brought up the issue of intelligence throughout your testimony and the gaps that were there and how we need to strengthen the intelligence. But I was struck by the fact that you said the FBI report, and my understanding is that report had some fairly specific information that was troubling. That you said that report did get sent to the Capitol Police, that it went to the folks in the Intelligence Department, but then you were not aware of it, which raises a really big question. It's something coming in like that right before an event that I think is significant. It does not get to operational commanders who are there to deal with it. How can that happen? How can you not get that vital intelligence on the eve of what's going to be in a major event?
What? Thank you, sir. I know that's something that's going to be looked at. I think that information would have been helpful to be aware of. Again, looking at the information for the first time yesterday, it is strictly raw data. It's raw intelligence information that has come in, seen on a social media post. Lots of people postings on social media that need to be, corroborated and confirmed. So it's coming in as raw data. So please keep that in mind. But I agree that's something we need to look at. What's the process and how do we streamline that information getting to where it needs to go?
Well, I understand it's raw data, but it's the eve of the event. You're not going to have time to do the kind of analysis that you would normally like to do. That is information that has to get to you. So that's clearly a major problem. And my question is also related to the report that was put out by Capitol Police, by your intelligence folks on January 3rd. The Intelligence Division of the Capitol Police issued an internal report which reportedly stated, and this is some of this has been out in the public domain, that instead of targeting counter-protesters, as you've seen in the prior events that occurred that you've referenced earlier, that, quote, this is quote that's been out in the public domain, that Congress itself is the target on the 6th by Trump supporters. Congress was the target. The report also mentioned that members of the Proud Boys, white supremacist groups, other extremist groups would be in attendance and, quote, again out in public sources, may be inclined to become violent. So you have your own report. Did you see that report that was put out on the 3rd?
Yes, I did.
So how is not that a warning of some extraordinary measures? Now, I understand you increased and you had folks there and you increased your presence. But how is that not a real big warning flag? And if it was, what exactly did you do when you read that report?
So that was one of the reports that contributed to the fact that we expanded our perimeter. I reached out, looking at it, I'd reach out to the Metropolitan Police Department, just knowing, even before that report, knowing, what that extremists were likely to be there. In the previous reports for it that has been called for on social media for people to be armed. In talking with our partners over at the Metropolitan Police Department, I reached out to say, hey, you're going to be able to provide us some support, and we coordinated that additional support the morning of the 6th. So, yeah, we did take all that in consideration as we developed the extensive security plans for this event.
So you changed plans on January 3rd after getting that report?
We adjust our perimeter. We did a number of things we actually were adjusting our perimeter probably a little bit before that as well.
So that was happening before. So we're going to want to know more specifically when you get that. And then, of course, I think we're going to see you got additional information from the FBI, for example, but that did not get to you. So
Right.
I understand that.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is important for us to understand, and I've heard all of you mention this in your testimony, that this was not just it was actually in response to Chairwoman's Klobuchar's question. It is not just a random violent attack. It was actually coordinated that you saw, and I believe in your testimony as well. I'm going to ask other witnesses to respond to this too, because all of you mentioned that. How do you define coordinated? What did we actually see from these folks that leads you to believe that it was coordinated? And I think in your testimony now you just mentioned military-style coordination. So that would mean command and control. It would mean understanding the layout of the Capitol. It may mean knowing the internal operations of defense perimeters, of folks that are engaged. Talk to me, what did you see that leads you to believe that this was a coordinated attack? And I would like our other witnesses to engage in that as well.
Yeah, I'm able to provide you a quick overview of why I think it was a coordinated attack. One, these people came specifically with equipment. You're bringing climbing gear to a demonstration. You're bringing explosives. You're bringing chemical spray, such as what Captain Mendoza had talked about. You're coming prepared. The fact that the group that attacked our West Front attacked our West Front approximately 20 minutes before the event over at the Ellipse ended, which means they were planning on our agency not being at what they call full strength. Watching the other event, saying, hey, that event's ending, okay, everybody get on post, they're going to be marching our way, knowing that we may not be at full strength at that time. And then also the fact that we were dealing with 2 pipe bombs that were specifically, set right off the edge of our perimeter to, what I suspect, draw resources away. I think there was a significant coordination with this attack.
Anyone else? Chief Conte, I think you also believed it was a coordinated attack?
Oh, absolutely. My view is from the day of the incident. I think there were hand signals that were being used by several of the insurrectionists. There was radio communication by several individuals that were involved. The coordinated use of chemical munitions to include bear spray by several people that were out there. I certainly believe it was coordinated. To Chief Sun's point regarding the placement of the pipe bombs in the areas, their discovery prior to this event, all of those things. And plus, adding to that, what we know in hindsight now, as a result of the ongoing investigation that's being handled by the FBI, as they continue to scrub social media, I think we're learning more and more and more that this was clearly a coordinated effort.
Real quick, Mr. Irving, and then I'll ask another question real quick, Mr. Irving.
Based on the information provided by Chief Conte and Chief Sund, I would agree the evidence would indicate a coordinated attack.
So we're looking at folks that were coming out in intelligence reports, that groups like the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, others that were engaged, these violent extremist groups, which we clearly need to collect more intelligence on. It'll be the subject of another hearing that we will do regarding this. But if you look at what the DOJ is now prosecuting, 200 federal cases. The FBI has linked at least 40 to extremist groups, 59 to other defendants that have connections on social media to violent or extremist rhetoric, conspiracy theories. This is clearly an area that we've got to focus on as to why did we not have more information about these groups that were coming here planning, and usually you leave a trail when you're planning, either that or you're real sophisticated using encrypted devices and other things, but those are things that we're going to have to be looking at. Clearly, the National Guard presence was critical. I know you're going to get a lot of questions related to that, but Chief Conte, in my remaining time, just a question. Yeah, and you mentioned this in your testimony, but in an earlier statement, Chief, you stated that you were stunned by quote, the tepid response of the Army officials in response to Chief Sund's request for assistance while the violent siege was escalating. Clearly, here we got a coordinated attack. All of you saw this immediately the way they were doing. I can imagine the conversations with the National Guard. And Chief, you were stunned by the tepid response. Could you clarify that and tell us exactly how those conversations went?
Yeah, so just sometime after 2:00 p.m., I had left the west front of the Capitol after initially being at the scene, assessing what was going on, looking at just how violent, looking at the violent actions that were taking place. Shortly thereafter, there was a phone call that was convened between several officials. Chief Sund was on the call, literally pleading there were several Army officials that were on the call. I don't know all by name who were on the call. Several officials from district government that were on the scene. Chief Sund was pleading for the deployment of the National Guard. And in response to that, there was not an immediate yes. The National Guard is responding. Yes, the National Guard is on the way. Yes, the National Guard are being restaged from traffic posts to respond. The response was more asking about the plan. What was the plan for the National Guard? The response was more focused on, in addition to the plan, the optics, how this looks with boots on the ground on the Capitol. And in my response to that was simply, I was just stunned that I have officers that were out there literally fighting for their lives. And, we're kind of going through, what seemed like an exercise to really check the boxes, and there was not an immediate response. When I asked specifically, Steve's son, Chief's son, was he requesting the National Guard, and was that request being denied? The response was no, we're not. From the U.S. Department of the Army was no, we're not denying the request, but they were concerned. They did have concerns. So I was just stunned at that response.
Thank you. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. Chief Sund, if I have your testimony correct this morning, I think what I'm hearing you say is based on the intelligence you saw on January the 3rd, after that on January the 4th, you decided this was going to be a different kind of protest than you'd seen in November and December, and that's when you asked for an expanded perimeter and National Guard assistance. Is that correct?
So the information we received, yes, it was very similar to the previous assessments. It was just a little bit more detailed. We had been analyzing kind of how we responded to the previous MAGA marches and decided to expand the perimeter. Really, when you expand a perimeter as large as we expanded it, it creates a large area you have to defend. And that was the primary reason, knowing that these protesters were coming here. We were the focus of the protest and the expanded perimeter, and we knew this was going to be a long day.
So did you know from the time you expanded the perimeter that you were going to have more help on all likelihood to defend that perimeter than your force would be able to provide?
We knew the additional support would be, we could utilize the additional support, yes.
So why did you believe that you needed the approval of Mr. Irving and Mr. Stinger to request assistance to the National Guard?
That's always been the case. We only requested the National Guard for very specific events, usually the inauguration, and that requires a declaration of emergency from the Capitol Police Board to utilize those resources.
Do you know if there's a statutory requirement for that?
I could look into that and get that to you as a follow-up if you'd like.
I don't know that there is, but I do know that if you get the approval to expand the perimeter and you don't have the assistance to do that, that's obviously a problem. Why didn't you contact the third member of the police board, the architect of the Capitol, Mr. Blanton?
Thank you for that question, sir. My conduit to the Capitol Police Board was usually through the House and Senate Sergeant Arms. They were the ones usually having the communications with the department, especially law enforcement related issues. They're both law enforcement, and also the fact that Mr. Stinger at the time is the Capitol Police Board chairperson. But usually outside the monthly Capitol Police Board meeting that we'd have, unless it was a issue specific to the architect regarding building structure, something like that, my conduit was regularly the House and Senate Sergeant Arms.
Why do you think the architect of the Capitol's on the police board?
As one of the voting members and providing oversight.
But apparently not enough oversight that you thought you needed to involve him in the conversation.
Like I said, my usual conduit was going through the House and Senate Sergeant Arms. That's already two people I got to go to. Going to three. In the future, I guess if that's something that's going to be, that we'll implement, then I will implement it. But I was just following my usual course of action.
So Mr. Irving and Mr. Stinger both, let's start with Mr. Irving. Why was the request for National Guard assistance not approved at the same time you approved the expansion of the perimeter? Mr. Irving? I think you're muted, Mr. Irving. Now you're definitely muted. Okay, now you should be fine. Go ahead.
Am I okay now?
You're okay
Yes.
now.
Thank you. I apologize for that. Senator, I did not take the call from Chief Sund on the 4th as a request. Chief Sund called me to tell me that he had received an offer from the National Guard to provide us 125 unarmed troops to work traffic control in the perimeter of the Capitol. Shortly after that discussion, I said, let's include Sergeant-at-Arms Stanger as chair of the board and another senior official with quite a bit of experience. The three of us talked it through. And during that call, the number one question on the table was, did the intelligence support it? did the intelligence support that additional offer for those 125 troops?
Did you discuss this with anybody except Sergeant Armstanger and Chief Sund?
No, it was just this one phone call. And during that call, we all agreed that the intelligence did not support the troops, and collectively decided to let it go. Michael Stenger then said, how about we put him on standby just in case? And that's what we ended up doing. But from what I remember, everyone was very satisfied that we had a robust plan, security plan, that was consistent with the intelligence that we had at the time.
Mr. Stenger, why did you think that the troops were on standby? They must have been standing way away from where we needed them if it took hours to get them here. What did that mean they were going to be on standby?
What I did when I spoke to the chief, when the chief brought up to me this attempt to get the National Guard, and it apparently wasn't going forward, I suggested to him that he reach out. He knew the National Guard commander from his previous work in the Metropolitan Police Department. And I suggested that he reach out to the National Guard commander for a couple of reasons. One of them was I had either read in the paper or heard on the news that the National Guard in D.C. was rather reticent to engage with demonstrations at this time because of the issues that had arisen during the White House demonstrations of a month ago, and that we need to make sure that the National Guard was engaged in this and that they would be willing to.
Well, do you think you did make sure that they were engaged and would be willing? I'm going to have to go to one more question here. Did you think they were engaged and would be willing if called on?
Yeah, that's what I think. What I asked the chief to determine from the general.
All right, Mr. Irving, you said in your testimony that when asked for National Guard assistance, you approved it. Mr. Sund stated that he asked for the National Guard assistance at 1:09, and you approved. It was approved at 2:10. Why would it take an hour to approve National Guard assistance on your part in that moment of crisis? Mr. Irving.
Senator, from my recollection, I did not receive a request for approval for National Guard until shortly after 2 p.m. when I was in Michael Stenger's office.
Let me get that straightened out. Mr. Sund, do you know when you asked for National Guard assistance? Was it 1:09 or was it 2 p.m.?
It was 1:09, sir.
1:09. And who did you ask for assistance at 1:09?
It was from Mr. Irving. I believe he was in the company of Mr. Stenger at the time as well.
And Mr. Irving, why would you not remember that?
Senator, I have no recollection of a conversation with Chief Sund. At that time, I was on the floor during the Electoral College session, and my conversation with Chief Sund in that time frame was shortly before 1:30, when I recall he was describing conditions outside as deteriorating. He may in fact be submitting a request, and I carried that forward. And that was as much as I can tell you. I have no phone record of a call from Chief Sund.
Did you discuss that request at 1:09 or whenever you got it with anybody else, or did you and Mr. Stenger make that decision then?
No, I did not get a request at 1:09 that I can remember. The first conversation I had with Chief Sund in that time frame was at 1:28, 1:30, and in that conversation, he indicated that conditions were deteriorating. He might be looking for National Guard approval and approval of our mutual aid agreements with local law enforcement. And I went to Mike Stenger's office awaiting an update.
Well, this is a time, Mr. Irving, I'm sure my colleagues will want to follow up on this because I'm out of time, but that's a time when the difference in 1:30 and 2:10 or 1:09 and 2:10 makes a big difference. One of the things I'm wondering, and we don't have time for you to answer this, but I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking here, is in a moment like this, if your focus is chiefly on the safety of House members, and I would certainly understand that, and Mr. Stenger's is chiefly on the safety of Senate members, maybe that's a problem here where the board really can't function as a board because you have such diverse areas of immediate responsibility. But whatever happened here doesn't seem to me to be in agreement with the various timeframes, and I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blunt. And I wanted, Senator Peters and I are going to trade off chairing here with the votes, and we have a set order that all the senator's staff have based on a melded set of rules between the two committees. And I'd like to submit for the record a written statement from the United States Capitol Police Labor Committee dated February 23rd, 2021. Thank you. Senator Portman.
Without objection, Ranking Member Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, with regard to the conversation we just had on the discrepancies with regard to National Guard assistance, I would request that both Chief Sund, you and Mr. Irving provide us with those phone records. I know there's been some interviews that have been conducted, but I'm not sure we have the phone records, and that seems that would clear up some of the confusion. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about preparedness. Chief Sund, in your testimony, you talked about the need for better intelligence and better coordination. That was your conclusion. And I think that's true. And certainly everything we have learned indicates that was part of the problem. But what about preparedness? We've received information that prior to January 6th, Capitol police officers were not trained on how to respond to an infiltration of the Capitol building. Is that correct, Mr. Sund?
When you talk about infiltration, you talk about a large insurrection like we saw on the January 6th? No.
And why not? Why wouldn't we be prepared for an infiltration of the Capitol? Given the risk that's out there, I would say to Mr. Irving and Mr. Stenger, both of you have had distinguished careers with the Secret Service. I would ask you all to just give me a quick yes or no answer. Does the Secret Service have training regarding infiltration as an example of the White House? Yes or no? Mr. Stenger? Mr. Irving?
Senator?
I'll take that as a yes. If it's
Yes.
a no, okay. Mr. Stenger, are you a yes also?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it seems obvious that you would have training on responding to an infiltration. So I think if nothing else comes out of this process, we've got to figure out how to deal with, again, the real danger that is out there, and it seems to me the intelligence reports, but also just the previous demonstrations would indicate a need for that kind of training. Let me ask you about something else, if I could, Mr. Sund, and that has to do with the U.S. Capitol police officers that I saw on video and the world saw fighting against this attack in street uniforms or soft uniforms. Many of them did not have riot gear. I'm told by contrast, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department provides all of its officers with such gear, including helmets, shields, gloves, gas masks. Having seen those incredibly disturbing videos and photographs of your brave officers attempting to hold the line to defend the Capitol without that kind of riot gear, are all Capitol police officers outfitted with riot gear?
No, they are not, sir.
They're not. And why are they not?
So if you look at the way we outfit our officers, and it'll probably be very similar to, I think you'll find even with Metropolitan, I've been with Metropolitan for a number of years, they'll have a certain number of officers, CDU platoons as they call. It's not the entire force that's outfitted to the level 1 CDU with the big protective gear, the helmets, things like that. So we outfit a number of we have 7 CDU platoons that we can activate. 4 of those platoons, it's 40 people in a platoon, are activated to what we call the level 1, the full CDU gear and equipment. It requires extensive costs, extensive training to keep and maintain that level. For us, a number of our officers are posted in interior posts, screening posts, things like that, where they, that gear wouldn't do them any suffice, wouldn't provide them any support. So we have determined up till January 6th that number of CDU platoons had sufficed for all the demonstrations that we had been dealing with on Capitol
Yeah,
grounds.
Mr. Sund, I would just say, obviously, those officers who you say had interior posts needed it that day. So it's not accurate to say that they didn't need it. But I know that you activated 7 of these civil civil disturbance unit platoons, and that only 4 of them had riot gear. I don't know why you would have a civil disturbance unit platoon that didn't have riot gear. But you've just testified that that's true, that only 4 of them had it. Is that correct?
That is correct. And just one additional point, since I've been chief, I've actually pushed for every member in the department to have riot helmets. I had ordered those back in September. We had been looking at delays because of COVID from the manufacturer getting them delivered, and they actually just started being delivered January 4th and distributed to our officers just days before this, with limited numbers being given to the officers prior to this event.
Yeah, too late for many of those officers. Chief Conte, the comment was made that Metropolitan Police does not all have riot gear. Is that true? I thought that the Metropolitan Police Department officers did have access to riot gear. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so we have 7 platoons that have the hardened gear, but all of our officers have ballistic helmets. All of our officers have batons. All of our officers are deployed with gloves as well, and gas masks. So our entire department are deployed with that level. But when you're talking about the harden all of the other extras, we have 7 platoons that have the additional. That's a different layer of protection.
But every officer has a helmet. Every officer has the protective gloves. Every officer has the baton. Is that correct?
And gas masks. That is correct.
And gas mask. Yeah. It appeared to the Metropolitan Police Department, I'm told, that the Capitol Hill police officers did not have the training in civil disturbance tactics that they had. That's what I was told by some of the interviews that we've had. Chief Conte, is that correct?
Yes, I've heard the same thing with respect to the training of the U.S. Capitol Police officers.
Are all of your Metropolitan Police officers trained in civil disturbance tactics?
We have platoons that are trained for every for every patrol district and special operations division. Some officers do not have the civil disturbance training. Those officers generally they work traffic duties or they work assignments back in patrol.
Chief Sund,
If I could add, they get it coming up. If I could add too, one other thing,
Yes.
all of our officers who leave the training academy, they get the basic civil disturbance unit training. So all of our officers do get the basic training, but we might have some members, for example, who've been on for 30 years and they haven't been CDU trained and they may work, back at a patrol district, but all of our members coming out the academy, they receive the civil disturbance unit training.
Mr. Sund, is that true with Capitol Hill police officers also? Are they all trained in civil disturbance tactics as they go through their training?
That was a process being implemented. I could check and let you know if that's been fully implemented for new recruits coming out of the academy. That was one of the initiatives I was working on.
So we were working on that, but as far as you know, this training was not being provided even for new officers, much less for those on the
I believe
force. Is that
I
correct?
believe the new officers coming out were, but I just need to confirm that.
Yeah, I think the bottom line here is that unfortunately our officers were not given the proper training with regard to infiltration of the building or the complex, with regard to dealing with civil disturbance, and they didn't have the equipment necessary to push back and, most importantly, to protect themselves. So my hope is that, again, one of the ways that this joint hearing and this committee report can be helpful is to bring the Capitol Police Department up to speed. And look, I appreciate the sacrifice and the bravery of that day, but I think we also owe it to those officers to provide them the training and the equipment they need to protect themselves and to protect the Capitol. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. The chair now recognizes Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to follow up on what Senator Portman said. I agree with his concerns, but I might ask a question from the Appropriations Committee, and I know time is limited, so these could be yes or no answers. The Appropriations Committee has always worked in a bipartisan fashion to get money to the police. So, Mr. Sun, yes or no? The Appropriations Committee, and ultimately the Congress, have met your request for salaries and operating expenses in every fiscal year. Is that not correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And Mr. Stanger, the Appropriations Committee and ultimately the Congress has met your request for salaries and operating expenses every fiscal year. Is that correct? I don't hear an answer. So I'll ask Mr. Irving. Mr. Irving, the Appropriations Committee and ultimately the Congress has met your request for salaries and operating expenses in every fiscal year. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Mr. Stanger?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
Thank you very much. So I have to think that we had not that we had inadequate resources, but a failure to deploy the people that we were supposed to. I look at those who appeared. I looked at the lives that were lost, the police who fought to protect our capital. We saw this as a violent, and I'd say a planned and organized attack on the United States and the United States government by domestic terrorists. I hope they're all going to be prosecuted as fully as they can. But those, when we see people encouraging them, including from the former president of the United States, who urged his followers to fight and to show strength, I really wonder why we didn't take this seriously enough to be prepared for them. The hours it took to bring in the National Guard and everything else. So I read, Mr. Sun, I read your detailed letter to Speaker Pelosi, but you said there wasn't enough intelligence shared, but in your same letter, you stated the intelligence assessment, I'm quoting here, indicated that members of the Proud Boys, white supremacist groups, Antifa, and other extremist groups were expected to participate in the January 6th event, and they may be inclined to become violent. How much more intelligence do we need than that?
Yes, sir, that is correct. That is what the intelligence assessment said. It was very similar to the intelligence assessments that we had for the November and December MAGA marches. The intelligence assessments that we had developed for the January 6th event, all the way up until January 6th, we're all saying very much the same thing, and that's what we had planned for. We had planned for the possibility of violence, the possibility of some people being armed, not the possibility of a coordinated military-style attack involving thousands against the Capitol.
Violence and armed strike me as a pretty strong thing. And I would suggest that everybody get together and look at the future, because if you have something that goes on for months, the president calling them, everybody else calling them, I worry that there was not more there. I think until we root out the hate and drove the rioters to the door that day, no fence or tank or barrier is going to provide the safety we need. We want safety, but also talk about Benjamin Franklin, who says, those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. But I know a vote is on, and before I close, I do want to commend Chief Conte for your swift response. You don't have an easy job charged with protecting a city as large as Washington, D.C., and balance the delicate balance with dozens of other law enforcement. But I think that I commend the two chairs and ranking members for holding this hearing. We'll hold more in appropriations, but we're going to look very closely at the request this year and say, what do we do if we have another one of these? I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Chair recognizes Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start off by just thanking our law enforcement witnesses for your service. There's 2020 is hindsight. It's pretty easy to money morning quarterback, and I want to make sure that we guard against doing so. Certainly what I've seen from testimony, it seems like there's a fair amount of thought, a fair amount of due diligence that went into this. So again, I appreciate your service. I also want to say I find the videos, as you said, Chief Sund, sickening. The violence reprehensible, the racial slurs repugnant. And I want to make sure the perpetrators, the people that engaged in the violence, are prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I've got a long list of questions, which this format really doesn't lend itself to asking. So what I will be doing is preparing a letter for the committee chair and hoping that they will ask those questions and investigate these issues that I'll be listing. But what I want to do is, in terms of asking some questions, I want to start out by reading excerpts from what I thought was a very interesting eyewitness account by J. Michael Waller. He is a senior analyst for a strategy at the Center of Security Policy. His areas of concentration include political and psychological warfare and subversion. He's a former professor and instructor at the Institute of World Politics at the Naval Postgraduate School. He's a current lecturer at the John F. Kennedy School of Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg. He wrote this piece titled, "I Saw Provocateurs at the Capitol Riot on January 6th. And he basically arrived on scene about 11:30 from Union Station, and I'll just start reading. At about 11:30, I walked from near Union Station and noticed a small number of Capitol Police dressed in full riot gear with shin guards and shoulder guards. Then I walked up Pennsylvania Avenue toward an empty Freedom Park. He noticed that the speech had broken up, and so a crowd was walking down Constitution Avenue. He joined them at 13th Street. But he said the mood of the crowd was positive and festive. Of the thousands of people I passed or who passed me along Constitution Avenue, some were indignant and contemptuous of Congress, but not one appeared angry or incited to riot. Many of the marchers were families with small children. Many were elderly, overweight, or just plain tired or frail, traits not typically attributed to the riot-prone. Many wore pro-police shirts or carried pro-police black and blue flags. Although the crowd represented a broad cross-section of Americans, mostly working class by their appearance and manner of speech, some people stood out. A very few didn't share the jovial, friendly, earnest demeanor of the great majority. Some obviously didn't fit in, and he describes 4 different types of people: plainclothes militants, agents provocateurs, fake Trump protesters, and then disciplined, uniformed column of attackers. I think these are the people that probably planned this. He goes on, the D.C. Metropolitan Police were their usual professionally detached selves, standing on curbs or at street crossings and exchanging an occasional greeting from marchers. When we crossed 1st Street Northwest to enter the Capitol grounds where the Capitol Police had jurisdiction, I noticed no police at all. Several marchers expressed surprise. The openness seemed like a courtesy gesture from Congress, which controls security. That appearance of low threat level made no sense. Yet no Capitol Police appeared anywhere from what we could see. Now, again, I'm taking these excerpts in order, but there's a lot more to this piece. What looked like tens or even hundreds of thousands of people surged down the avenues as far as one can see, but almost everyone seemed talkative and happy. No police could be seen on the platform for now. No police could be seen anywhere. People kept surging in from Constitutional Avenue, and the plaza quickly filled up and overflowed onto the lawn. Everyone squeezed closer and closer together, with most in high spirits. Some trouble began up in the front, near the base of the inaugural platform itself, but we could not see what was happening. Then something happened at the front of the crowd. It seemed like a scuffle, but from 40 feet back, I couldn't see. People started chanting USA, USA, and other slogans. For a few seconds, I saw what looked like police in a tussle with some of the marchers up front. What appeared to be an organized group in civilian clothes. This organized group are the cell I would call the plainclothes militants. They fit right in with MAGA people. Suddenly, energy surged from the front of the crowd as the anti-riot police, above on the inaugural platform, visibly tensed up. One fired a tear gas canister, not at the plainclothes militants at the front line, but into the crowd itself. Then another. Flash grenades went off in the middle of the crowd. The tear gas changed the crowd's demeanor. There was an air of disbelief as people realized that the police whom they supported were firing on them. "What are you doing? We support you," someone yelled. All of a sudden, pro-police people felt the police were attacking them, and they didn't know why. More tear gas. A canister struck a girl in the face, drawing blood. The pro-police crowd went from disbelief and confusion to anger. I'll stop there. The last 5 pages is titled "Provocateurs Turn Unsuspecting Marchers into an Invading Mob." So I'd really recommend everybody in the committee read this account, and I ask that it be entered into the record. But Chief Sund, I want to ask you, is one of the House managers made a big deal that this was predictable, this was foreseeable, which I don't believe. Do you believe that what happened, the breach of the Capitol, did you believe that's foreseeable and predictable?
No, I don't, nor do, if you look at some of our other partner agencies, I think Acting Chief Conte actually made the statement that a breach of the Capitol was not something anybody anticipated, nor do I think some of our federal partners expected it. I don't think Secret Service would have brought up the Vice President if they expected it.
Is part of that because of what you'd experienced in the past, what this Mr. Waller experiences? The vast majority of Trump supporters are pro-law enforcement, and the last thing they would do is violate the law?
I will say that information I've received from some of my officers were they were trying to prevent people from coming into the building, and people were showing up saying, "Hey, we're police, let us through," and still wanting to violate the law to get inside the building. So,
Again, I've got a long, long list. I just want to close with the 2 former Sergeant of Arms. I knew these committees were going to start an investigation. I waited a couple weeks. I didn't see any letter go out, oversight letter, so I wrote my own on the 21st. And I just have a question for both the former Sergeant of Arms. Did you get my letter, my oversight letter with my questions?
I did not receive your letter. I left town right after I resigned, but I certainly look forward to working with you and your staff to answer your questions.
Okay, well, if you could give us an address, because we sent it to the Acting Sergeant of Arms. That Acting Sergeant of Arms won't even let us know whether they passed that letter along to you. Apparently they didn't. Mr. Stenger, did you receive my letter?
I don't recall it, Senator, but it might have come, but I don't recall.
Chief Sund, one last question for you. Do you regret resigning?
yes, I do, sir. I certainly do regret resigning. I love this agency. I love the women and men of this agency, and I regret the day I left.
Well, Mr. Irving, Mr. Stenger, I really wish you'd respond. First of all, look for my letter, and I'd like an answer to that as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. We're waiting for Senator Warner and any other member. I see Senator Rosen. Would you like to go ahead? Because you're the first member on. Senator Rosen.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Senator Klobuchar, and thank you, everyone, for being here today and springing this hearing. It's much needed, and I think it's the first of many. But I'd like to start off by expressing that my thoughts are with the brave Capitol Police officers. They put their lives on the line to protect us on January 6th, and their heroic actions, like the ones of Eugene Goodman, they redirected those violent rioters away from us. They're going to forever be embedded in our minds. And we know that so many of these courageous men and women, they're really hurting in the aftermath of the insurrection. And I've been particularly heartbroken to hear about the death of Capitol Police Officer Howard Liebengood. He was protecting the Senate since 2005. He was stationed by the door of my Russell office. My prayers are with him, his family, and his loved ones. But, when the insurrectionists, when they came to storm our Capitol on January 6th, they came armed not only with weapons, but also with hate. Mere weeks before International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the world watched in horror as a rioter inside the Capitol proudly wore a Camp Auschwitz shirt as he and others violently pushed forward on the House and the Senate floors. All the while, the rioters, they're waving Confederate flags, they're hanging nooses on the front lawn, they're verbally assaulting a Jewish reporter outside the Capitol, saying, "You are cattle" today. That refers to cattle cars that were used to transport Jews to Nazi death camps during the Holocaust. This violent attack on the Capitol featured followers from the anti-Semitic QAnon conspiracy theory. So, Mr. Conti, on January 4th, Metro Police Department arrested Enrique Chirrillo, leader of the racist anti-Semitic Proud Boys hate group. FBI claims the next day it shared with MPD concrete intelligence about extremist plans for violence on January 6th, including specific threats on members of Congress, maps of the tunnels under the Capitol complex. If MPD was tracking extremist, potentially violent white supremacist activity, then what exactly did you know on January 5th, and why didn't you alert anyone?
Thank you for that question. What the FBI sent, ma'am, on January 5th was in the form of an email. I would certainly think that something as violent as an insurrection in the Capitol would warrant, a phone call or something. But as Chief Sund mentioned earlier, the information that was sent was uncorroborated information. It was raw information that we had. That we received through the same lines through the JTTF. That information was not fully vetted and had not been sent through the chains of the Metropolitan Police Department. What the Metropolitan Police Department was prepared for was the larger violence and demonstrations that we expected to see in our city.
That's fine. I have to ask Mr. Sund the same question now. What did you know as of Tuesday night, January 5th? Because I have a follow-up for both of you on this one. So quickly, Mr. Sund, what did you know on January 5th? And were you alarmed or not alarmed? What did you expect?
So yeah, I was concerned. We had the intelligence that was coming out, the intelligence that we'd be planning for. Again, keep in mind, the intelligence assessments that we had developed at the end of December, the beginning of, and the one for January 3rd were very, very similar. They just provided a little bit more specificity. So we had already been planning for the threat for violence, the threat for armed possible people protesting, and that's what we were planning for. Now, if you're referring to the Norfolk letter again, I just became aware that the department was aware of that 24 hours ago. So on the 6th or the 5th or the 4th, I was not aware that memo existed.
So you're saying that there's a breakdown between you and the FBI, because we have rallies, protests, and things happen in Washington all the time. How many could both of you just maybe give a guess, how many do you think are usually with armed insurrectionists or come heavily armed out of the hundreds, perhaps thousands of rallies that we see in Washington through the year?
We know the last three incidents, the first two MAGA rallies, men and women of the Metropolitan Police Department recovered firearms from several people who were attending the demonstrations at the first MAGA rally as well as the second one. Aside from that, those have been really the only demonstrations where we've seen individuals coming armed.
Well, do you think this was an intelligence breakdown or a resource issue?
I think that the intelligence did not make it where it needed to be. You think the FBI did not raise this to the level they needed to with the Metropolitan Police Department, in your mind? We received it in the form of an email that came as an alert bulletin at 7:00 p.m. the day before. Al Posture is the Metropolitan Police Department. Again, I think it's reflected in our deployment in terms of not just the National Guard that was deployed, but as well as other officers from surrounding jurisdictions. That reflected the seriousness that we took with respect to the threats that we were expecting to see in the city.
Mr. Sund, can you tell me, do you think this was a resource issue or intelligence breakdown or something else? If you be brief, because this is very important.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. I'll be very brief. It was part of my introduction. I think it was more than just the Norfolk letter. I think we need to look at the whole entire intelligence community and the view they have on some of the domestic extremists and the effect that they have. I look at this as a intelligence problem that impacted this event. Yes.
So what information would you have had to have heard to have raised up the flag to get more resources for the Capitol Police? Because thank goodness, I mean, we saw loss of life, and thank goodness there wasn't more, but one is too many. So what is your threshold then? What should be the threshold to
Well, I
protect the
did-
Capitol and protect your officers?
I did in advance reach out to the Washington DC Police to coordinate resources, and I did also go to the both the House and Senate Sergeant Arms to request the National Guard.
And
Okay.
Mr. Conti, I think I have 5 seconds and we can take this off the record, but I believe that there's some plans by QAnon for something to happen at the Capitol on March 4th. I want to hear what steps we're taking to protect the Capitol on March 4th from any more violent extremists. Thank you.
Okay, we'll have you talk to him about that later. Senator Warner has arrived via video. And I also want to mention Senator Peters will work with our witnesses for restroom breaks and the like and let us know so that we don't want to take a long break, but I can imagine you need a break at some point here. So Senator Warner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. We've talked a little bit about the deployment or lack of deployment of the National Guard. And one of the questions, I guess, Mr. Sund, or frankly, or Chief Conte, the fact that the district did not have the ability to bring the Guard to the table because of, frankly, the fact that they're not a state and Mayor Bowser is not treated, I think, in a totally fair fashion in this. This may be outside your lane, but her inability to bring the Guard to the table, and actually any of you on the panel can answer this, that to me is a reflection of the disempowerment of the district. On a going forward basis, at least in terms of being able to deploy the Guard, shouldn't the mayor of the District of Columbia have the ability to do that without all the additional hurdles they have to go through in terms of federal checklist?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that.
Does anybody else want to answer on that question as well?
Yes, sir. I'm happy to add in. I think we have an established process for the Capitol Police to make the request through the Capitol Police Board that is also equally as effective.
Well, again, I feel like the long-term discrimination against the district, we've seen it in some of the COVID legislation where they did not receive the same kind of level of support that other states did. We saw it play out real time in terms of on January 6th, the hurdles from the previous administration. I actually have concerns whether the deployment of the Guard was affirmatively slowed down. I hope that we in the Congress will, as a supporter of DC statehood, I'd like to see that move forward, but even short of that, trying to ensure that the mayor has appropriate powers going forward. I know there were some questions already raised about the FBI and whether the intel that came out of the Norfolk FBI office was ever fully relayed to all of you individuals. But can you talk more generally about the FBI's responsiveness, sharing of intelligence? I had a number of conversations. I called Director Wray on Monday, the 4th, trying to express concerns that there might be this kind of activity. I never expected this level of violence. I had a number of conversations with senior FBI leadership on the 5th through the 6th. I candidly I don't think even the full FBI could have been fully informed of all of what was going to come to pass, but I felt like the FBI felt that they were in better shape in terms of intel and preparation than what came to be the case. And I'd like each of you to comment on how well you felt that the FBI did in terms of sharing intelligence and then coordinating when the actual activities of the 6th played out.
So I'll go ahead and, did you want me to address that first?
Yeah, I mean, I can't see where y'all are, so every one of you can take a crack at that.
I'll go ahead and start first. I think the relationship we have with the FBI is outstanding. I think in my time with the Metropolitan and my time here, we've seen nothing but the relationship get better. The construct that we have that's very similar to some of the other major cities is having the Joint Terrorism Task Force, being involved with that. The information we're getting in is is good. I think the process and having, like I said earlier, the wider lens of what information is being collected, maybe looking at the agencies that are consumers of their information and what their intelligence collection requirements are is something that we need to look at. But I think, getting that information in and then having it processed and pushed forward in an effective manner is something we need to look at. I would say on the 6th, when this started happening, immediately the FBI, as being a partner of ours, established a process where with Capitol Police and FBI Police, we can begin to analyze video footage, analyze other evidence to begin going out and making arrests of the individuals that had created the insurrection of the Capitol.
Yeah, I'll go next.
Did we get enough intel beforehand? If we get the balance of the panel to respond.
Yeah, sure. I would echo what Chief Sun just mentioned. We've had a great working relationship with the FBI. I think it's a whole of intelligence approach, not specifically just the FBI. When we have something as significant as what occurred here at the U.S. Capitol, if there is information, specific information out there that our government is responding to, I would think that something of that nature would rise to the level more than just an email that's sent to law enforcement agencies. That should be a larger, more involved conversation about specifics, not just some of the unvetted raw information that's out there. We see a lot of that, but I think it's more of a whole intelligence approach, not specifically the FBI. They are great partners to the Metropolitan Police Department.
Thank you. Let me just, I don't know if any of the other panel members want to add any comment on that. Let me just say that this is, my concern is that in Virginia, we've seen these kind of anti-government extremists take to the streets of Charlottesville in 2017, resulting in the death of Heather Heyer. We see the same kind of groups come to the forefront on January 6th. I think this is an ongoing threat to national security. I fear at times that while the FBI and others have pointed this out, that it didn't get the level of serious review that it should have. With the prior administration, I felt at times that they did not want to take the information that was coming out of the FBI. I hope on a going forward basis, we're going to be able to be more coordinated in terms of taking on anti-government extremism, whether it comes from the left or the right. This is a real ongoing threat. I can tell you from our intelligence committee that we've seen that many of these groups have connections and ties to anti-government extremist groups in Europe, where they've taken a great precedent. I know my time's expired, Madam Chairman, but this is something we need more work on. Thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you very much, Senator Warner. We look to working with you and the Intelligence Committee on this. Next will be Senator Langford, and after that, Senator Carper.
Thank you. Mr. Sun, I want to try to validate something. There's a letter that's in the public domain at this point. That's an 8-page letter that was written to Speaker Pelosi that is attributed to you to try to explain the events of that day. Are you familiar with that letter in the public domain, and is it accurate?
Yes, it is, sir.
So in the letter itself, you describe several things in this and the details and the timeline on it. Can you tell me why you wrote this letter to Speaker Pelosi? What was the purpose of the letter?
I feel at the time I resigned. I had limited communications with my department. I know my department was getting ready to go and testify at some of the initial committee hearings, and I think that she had called for my resignation without full understanding of what we had prepared for, what we had gone through. I think she deserved to read, firsthand what we had prepared for and what I dealt with that for that 6th.
Okay, that's helpful. You had said in this, you talked several times about thousands of well-coordinated, well-equipped violent criminals and described them with climbing gear and all the things that you've also testified here. You also mentioned this letter about the pipe bombs that were located, that the first word would come at 12:52 that a pipe bomb had been located at the Republican National Committee headquarters. How was that located? Who found it, and why was that particular moment the moment that it was found?
I don't know why that was a particular moment that was found. I believe it was an employee of the Republican National Committee that had located it in the rear of the building that had called it into Capitol Police Headquarters.
You had mentioned before that you thought this was part of the coordination, that there were several that were out there that would take away resources at that exact moment. But there's no way to know that they would find it at that exact moment. I'm glad they did find it. They found another one at the Democrat headquarters as well at 150, and you document that as well. But you had to send quite a few individuals to be able to go to the RNC and the DNC to be able to go deal with those explosives that were planted there. Is that correct?
That is correct. And just for your information, the RNC pipe bomb, that was one that was really run by Capitol Police. The DNC Metropolitan ended up taking that and running that so we can run two concurrently. That resulted in the evacuation of two congressional buildings, the Cannon House Office building as well as one of the Library of Congress buildings. So it took extensive resources.
So the assaults in the Capitol is not what caused the evacuation of those buildings. The discovery of those pipe bombs is what caused the evacuation of those buildings.
That is correct, sir.
There's been quite a bit of conversation today and quite a few members here that have talked about the National Guard and the length of time that it took to be able to go through the bureaucratic process to be able to get them deployed. I do think that needs to be shortened, obviously, in a deployment structure and the complexity of the bureaucracy here. But it seems to be a misunderstanding on this dais of some individuals describing the National Guard as if they're the riot police that can automatically be called out. They're not. Were you expecting them to be like a rapid response SWAT team at this point? What's a typical response from the National Guard to be able to call them out when they are not currently positioned?
I believe the typical response once they're approved is approximately 2 hours.
Okay, but then the approval process is obviously multiple hours to do that or multiple days to do that. You had started that process several days before in making some requests.
So that is correct. As far as the process, my initial request was over to Mr. Irving. It was actually an in-person request on the 4th, and it wasn't until the evening of the 4th that I talked to General Walker that he informed me that if needed, because Mr. Stinger wanted me to ask him if they could lean forward, they could get 125,
right,
if needed, in a fairly quick fashion once approved. So that's what led it into January 6th when we made the initial request at 109.
But that 125 individuals from the National Guard that were prepared to be able to move faster because they were in streets and different places doing traffic duty at that point, you had already been informed that the city of Washington, D.C. and the mayor's office had made a request to DOD, and DOD had approved it, that none of them would be armed, none of them would have heavy gear on, there would be no military vehicles that would be available to them. They had to use unmarked vans and other government vans, and there would be no helicopters that would be used. Those were prohibited that day for those 125 individuals that were already on the street. Is that correct?
So just for a correction, at the time, no, I did not know that was the restrictions being placed on them. And two, when I talked to General Walker the evening of the 4th, which was Monday evening, the 125 he was going to give us were 125 that were doing COVID relief for the District of Columbia, not assigned to the traffic post.
Okay, so the individuals that were assigned to traffic duty had no weapons, had no military vehicles to move, had no overhead visual on anything. That had all been requested no from the city of Washington, D.C. And then for the other individuals that could be assigned to you as a rapid force, those are folks that were currently doing COVID duty. So you had no SWAT team. This description is very interesting to me around this dais, that people think that suddenly the National Guard just bursts in and is ready to go on that. That's not what the National Guard is prepositioned to do.
That is correct. Anytime we've requested the National Guard, they've been in an unarmed fashion. I was looking for them to help support the perimeter that we had established.
Okay, there's been some concern that I've talked to some of the officers here, and there's obviously been some conversation around this dais as well about the rules of engagement and about training and authorization. There wasn't training for what to do if a mass group actually comes through the door and tries to burst through, whether it's an insurrection type event, whether it's just a mob that's gone crazy and whatever it may be, or a protest that gets out of hand to be able to burst through the door. There was no clarity for the officers inside the building on their rules of engagements once they actually came to the building. They literally, my impression is, had to make it up on their own, and they determined their stand was going to be where the members and the staff were located. That was going to be their stand to start using lethal force. So I have a couple questions for that. At this point now, and I understand hindsight's 2020, is there a need for much greater, less than lethal force capability on officers at the time, or available to officers at the time that they have less than lethal capabilities, and clearer rules of engagement of what to do if you have a group of individuals come into the building unauthorized?
So just for a little clarification, we do train for people trying to get into the building. We don't train for, when I said, an insurrection of thousands of people.
Right.
And our officers do have less lethal capability that they carry with them. With hindsight being what it is from January 6th, absolutely, I think there needs to be additional training, additional equipment to consider this type of attack in the future.
Well, the challenge is we all watched this summer. In fact, this committee at Homeland Security had a hearing on the assaults on a federal courthouse in Portland and went through, and all of us saw for a month individuals just attack that courthouse day after day after day, and we saw the techniques that were used. Some of those same techniques were used by individuals that came in here. I'm not saying it was the same individuals, but some of those same techniques of trying to be able to work to the fence, to be able to find it, to be able to find a way to be able to attack officers. So the challenge is that we saw that this was rising, I guess, that people were watching on TV, people attacking a federal institution all summer long. And it is a follow-up that we're going to have to do in the days ahead of how to be able to get less than lethal capability and to find ways to be able to stop any kind of assault of a number of individuals to be able to come on the Capitol. So I appreciate your service. I appreciate very much the officers that continue to be able to serve, because they've not had a gap. They've not had a break since that time period. And I know you still interact with them, at least I hope you do. And I would encourage you to pass on from us our gratitude. And we're all looking at this as a hindsight 2020, saying, why couldn't you read the tea leaves at this particular scrap of intelligence that came in the night before? None of us saw it at this level. And so we're grateful for the service they continue to do, and let's find the lessons we can learn.
Thank you very much, sir. I know they appreciate your support as well as the support of Congress. They're a hell of a police agency.
Okay, thank you, Senator Langford. Next, thank you for your patience, Senator Carper.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Madam Chair. Chief Conte, as a former governor of the first state of Delaware, for 8 years, I recall numerous instances in which I called on the Delaware National Guard in emergencies. They could have been the floods, blizzards, ice storms, drought, you name it, a lot more. I know the importance of the valiant work that our citizen soldiers have done for decades in the first state and other states around the country. As we have learned, in contrast to every other state's National Guard in the country, the DC National Guard operates differently. And I'm convinced if someone had been able to activate the DC National Guard and have 1,000 or 2,000 guardsmen and women deployed at the Capitol in a timely way on the 6th of January, this death and destruction would not have occurred. The leader of unlike all the states of the 50 states that we have, the leader of the District of Columbia is not empowered to activate the DC National Guard during an emergency. That's one of the reasons why I've worked for years with Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton in support of legislation to admit Washington, D.C. as our 51st state and to provide equal rights to the Americans who make this community of over 700,000 people their home. Here's a question, Chief Conte, in your testimony, you highlight that a request for DC National Guard assistance at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th would have had to have been made by the U.S. Capitol Police with the consent of the U.S. Department of Defense. Can you just take a minute to explain that process and why Mayor Bowser is not able to request DC National Guard assistance when federal installations and property as well as human lives are threatened in the district that she leads? Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, so the mayor does not have full authority over the National Guard to include their activation or deployment. When the mayor, we make a request as the District of Columbia, we make a request, we send that to the federal government. Ultimately, the Secretary of the Army receives that request. There's a whole approval process that request has to go through in order for National Guard resources to be deployed to the District of Columbia. Unlike governors in other states who are able to activate their National Guard without going through those approval processes and receiving approval from the highest level of the federal government. That just does not have to take place in other states. So a real hindrance to us in terms of response and the ability to call them up.
Thanks for that response. Could you just take a minute to share with us your thoughts on whether having the DC National Guard under the command of a mayor or even a governor of a neighboring state might help the DC Metropolitan Police in coordinating with federal authorities to better protect the city and its citizens, and along with federal installations during an assault like the one we experienced on January the 6th?
Yes, I think we certainly should. We know even on that day, on January the 6th, prior to any movement of the National Guard from the assignments that they had been given, the traffic posts, again, that required approval at the highest levels of the federal government, to include the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense, in order to just move the National Guard or a change of mission in essence. So yes, I think that should certainly be something that falls under the mayor's authority.
All right, thanks so much. A question, if I could, for Mr. Sun. Mr. Sun, in your testimony, you state that the events of January 6th were not the result of poor planning on behalf of the U.S. Capitol Police, but rather a lack of actionable intelligence that would have allowed the let me start over. But rather a lack of actionable intelligence that would have allowed the U.S. Capitol Police, or the Capitol Police, to properly prepare. As I was looking through Mr. Stinger's testimony, and former Sergeant at Arms for the U.S. Senate, he states, and I want to quote, he says, "The sharing of information and resources is paramount for success." That's his quote. I strongly agree with that statement. Mr. Sun, what went wrong leading up to January 6th with regard to gathering and sharing actionable intelligence? Why do you think the likelihood of a truly devastating attack was so badly underestimated, Mr. Sun?
I think as you start to hear from some of the federal agencies on the investigations that are currently going on, where they're finding evidence that this was a coordinated attack that had been coordinated among numerous states for some time in advance of this, that's the information that would have been extremely helpful to us. For them to detect some type of level of coordination that would have given us the indication that we're going to see more than just a may become violent, may be inclined to violence type of preparations. You look at it now, you see, knowing what occurred, you see what type of resources were brought to bear around the Capitol. That type of information could have given us, sufficient advance warning to plan for more of an attack such as what we saw.
The great Paul Newman movie, Cool Hand Luke, the line you probably, a lot of people, certainly in my generation, remember. What we have here is a failure to communicate. That was right at the end of the film. What we have here is a failure to communicate. Did we have a failure to communicate here? And I'm not one who's crazy about like pointing fingers and assigning blame, but to whom do we assign that failure to communicate?
I believe that question's for me, sir. What I look at is, we have a process for communications, and it being a consumer of intelligence, I look at it more of, I think there's a failure of having a wide enough lens to look at what are the current threats that we're facing in a nation now from some of the domestic extremists. I think the communications processes are there. They need to be worked on a little bit, but I think the intelligence community needs to broaden its aperture on what information it collects.
We now know in retrospect that the gathering on the rioters on January 6th didn't begin on January 5th or the 4th or the 3rd. It started like weeks before, and was fomented and encouraged, as we now know, by among others, our president. And somehow that all of that work and all the intelligence that was gathered by the FBI and other Homeland Security never found its way to the people who right here in DC could have used it the most to have avoided the tragedy of January the 6th. Thank you. Our thanks to particularly the officers of the U.S. Capitol Police and others who joined them in trying to protect us in this Capitol on that sad day.
I know we have several members ready to go, and we want you to go as quickly as possible, but there's been a request from our witnesses who have been here a long time. If we could give them a 5-minute break, and then we will reconvene in 5 minutes with additional questions. So we will recess for 5 minutes.